Today's daf is daf Kuf Gimel. On the top of the daf, Rabba Omar Yahanak. Now we had a machlokes between Rav and Shmuel on daf Kuf Beis Omid Beis, and we're talking about Motzei Shabbos, that's Yontiv, and the Seder HaBrachos. Rav holds that first we start with Kiddush, and then we go to Havdalah. And Shmuel's of the opinion just the opposite, that we begin with Havdalah, and then we go on to Kiddush. And now we have Rabbah. Rabbah's Shita is fundamentally in agreement with Shmuel, and we should begin with Havdalah and then go on to Kiddush. But he holds that Yayin Havdalah Ner Kiddush, that in contrast to Shmuel, who has Yayin Ner Havdalah Kiddush, which means that according to Shmuel, the Ner comes before the Havdalah. Rabbah puts Havdalah before Ner because we should not put together these two. Kiddush is to be Makadish the Yom with a very intense Kedusha, a Kedusha Chamura. Havdalah, in a sense, is antithetical to Kiddush. And therefore, because of that thesis and antithesis, he wants to put the bracha of Havdalah, the bracha of Ner, of Eish, in a way that it sort of separates between the Yayin that he started with and the Kiddush that he ends with. Because from Yayin, he goes on to Havdalah, and then he wants to put the Ner in between, wedging, as it were, between Havdalah and Kiddush. Levi Omar, Kiddush, Ner, Yayin, Havdalah. Levi begins with Kiddush like Rav, that Kiddush comes before Havdalah, but he disagrees with Rav with regard to the bracha of Yayin, of Borei Pri HaGofen. And he believes that the Yayin should be close to the Havdalah. And therefore, he's going to push off Yayin from the beginning until next to Havdalah, right before Havdalah. Otherwise, he says it doesn't look like he's being Mavdil on Yayin. Rabbanon Amri, Kiddush, Yayin, Ner, Havdalah. They agree with Rav that Kiddush comes before Havdalah. They also agree with Levi that the bracha of Yayin should be right attached to the bracha of Havdalah. But they hold that the bracha of Ner should come before the bracha of Havdalah, like in every Motzi Shabbos. So therefore they want to set up the Birchas HaKiddush first, then, as it were, going on to Havdalah, it's Yayin, Ner, Havdalah, as it is on every Motzi Shabbos. Mar Berei D'Ravona, Omar, Ner, Kiddush, Yayin, Havdalah. We should be Makdim Kiddush to Havdalah like Rav, and he wants the Birchas HaYayin to be close to Havdalah like Levi, but he holds that he should set up the Birchas HaNer, and it should be the first of all the brachos. Now, why should Ner be the first of all brachos? Because immediately he gets benefit from the Ner. And that Hanor from the Ner generates a chiv bracha on the Ner. Marta Omar B'Shmei Rabbi Yeshua, Ner, Yayin, Havdalah, Kiddush. He agrees with Shmuel that Havdalah should come before Kiddush, and that Yayin should come before Havdalah, and therefore, after he does Ner, meaning he immediately benefits from the Ner, like we saw in Ma'aberei D'Ravona, so he makes the bracha Ner first. The Yayin he wants to be before Havdalah, so that the Yayin now is Chal on Havdalah and on the Kiddush, but Havdalah comes before Kiddush, like Shmuel. Sholach le'avua de Shmuel l'Rabbi. Yilamdenu Rabbeinu Seder Avdolas Heicha. In a case where he's being mavdil on Motzei Shabbos, but it's also Kiddush for Avdolah. What should be Kiddush for Yontiv? What should be the Seder HaBrochos? Sholach lei. So Rabbi sent him the following answer: Kach Omar Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. Shomer Mishum Ovid. Shomer Mishum Rabbi Shua ben Chananya. Ner Havdolah Yain V'Kiddush. In other words, he agrees with Shmuel that Havdolah comes before Kiddush. He holds that we should be kovea all the brachos on the Birchas Hayayin, and he wants to set up the Birchas Hayayin between Havdolah and Kiddush so that the Yayin can sort of like go Miliel u'Milarat, meaning it could go back on the Havdolah and it could go forward on to Kiddush. So he wedges the Yayin between Havdolah and Kiddush. Fundamentally, he agrees with Shmuel that Havdolah comes before Kiddush, but he wants the Yayin to be, as we said before, after Havdolah but before Kiddush. Amar Rab Chanina. Rab Chanina tries to explain the logic that underlies the sheet of Shmuel and those who agree with Shmuel that Havdolah comes before Kiddush. Mashal to Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, because Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, like Shmuel, holds that Havdolah comes before Kiddush. The mashal is l'melech sheyotzim in the ear, both shah farkos nichnas le'ir. So the king is leaving the city and he deserves an escort. And one of his outstanding officers is coming into the city. So what do we do first? Do we go out to greet the officer or do we escort the king? And the answer is Malavid Isabella. First, we escort the king on his way out of the city. V'achkach yotzim l'kras Iparkos, to be makabel pnei hasar. So too, first we should escort the Shabbos with the bracha of Havdolah, and only afterwards we should be makabel the Yontiv, which in this mashal is like the Aparkos. And then we recite Kiddush after Havdolah. My Haviole. In other words, according to Rav, we were talking about, if you take a look back on Kuf Beis Amid Beis, we were talking about Yayin, Kiddush, Ner, Havdolah. We were talking, let's say, for example, in a case where the seventh day of Pesach was on a Motzei Shabbos. But what happens on the first night of Pesach? He has to add Shechianu. And where do we put Shechianu? Abai Omar, Yayin, Kiddush, Zman, Ner, Havdolah. So again, Yayin, Kiddush, Ner, and Havdolah, that's Rav. But Abai says that according to Rav, we should insert the bracha of Zman, the bracha of Shechianu, after Kiddush, before Havdolah. And that makes absolute sense because Abai holds, according to Rav, you have to finish with Kiddush and then start with Havdolah. The Birchas Hazman is part of Kiddush. And Rav Amar Yakna has. Rav says we're going to place Shechianu at the very end, which is very odd because he started with Yayin Kiddush, and then you went into Havdolah, and then you pushed off the Zman. Why would you push off the Zman to after Havdolah? And the answer is that Rav is of the opinion that just like Kiddush, we always say the Birchas Hazman at the end, so too we have this entity of Kiddush / Havdolah, and it all becomes like one long bracha, and the Zman should be postponed until the end, just like it is in every Kiddush. V'hilchasa kir Rav, the Gemara Paskins Yakna has, like Rav. Rav Huna bar Yehuda ikla lebei Rava. So Rav Huna finds himself in the house of Rava on a Motzi Shabbos. Aisu lekamayu ma'ar ubesamim. So they brought a candle and besamim for Avdollah. Baruch Rava besamim bereisha. Rava first made the bracha on the besamim, v'hadar amar, and then afterwards he made the bracha on the ner. Amalei, so Rav Huna says to Rava after the end of the Avdollah, he says v'habena beit Shammai ubein beit Hillel ma'ar bereisha v'hadar abesamim. That first you make the bracha on the candle and then on the besamim, and that's agreed upon by both Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Maihi, where do you find this machlokas Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel? Disnan, we learned in Masechet Brachos. The Mishnah is on Daf Nun Aleph Amud Beis with regard to a person who only has one cup of yain, and he needs to be mavdil, and he also needs to recite Birkas Hamazon on that same kos. On this, we have a debate between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. What should be the Seder HaBrachos? Beit Shammai Omrim, Ner, Mazon. Mazon means Birkas HaMazon, Besamim, Ve'avdolah. So it means that according to Beit Shammai, he begins the Havdalah with Ner, but then immediately he recites Birkas HaMazon. And the reason for that is because he ate a meal, he has to have Birkas Hamazon. He can't postpone that bracha because he's obligated in that bracha. And it could be that Beit Shammai holds that he begins with Ner because he immediately has benefit from the Ner. He has to thank Hashem for that benefit. Beit Hillel Omrim, Ner. Beit Hillel agree that you start with Ner, but in terms of the Seder Advarim, right after Ner comes Besamim, and then Birkas Hamazon, ending with Havdalah. And the reason for Beis Hillel is because the Besamim is L'Kavod HaShabbos. And therefore, according to Beis Hillel, he wants to be Makdim Besamim, which is L'Kavod HaShabbos, before Birkas Hamazon. No discussion here about the bracha on yayin. It could be that everybody agrees that he should recite the Birkas HaYayin after Birkas HaMazon. But in any event, we see clearly that according to our Mishnah, quoted here, both Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai agree that the bracha on Ner comes before the bracha on Besamim. That was never an issue. The issue is whether or not you wedge Birkas Hamazon between Ner and Besamim, but certainly Ner comes before Besamim. And therefore, Rav Huna says to Rava, why did you make the bracha on the Besamim before the Ner? Ani Rava Basrei, and Rava answers the claim and the argument of Rav Huna. The Amar, and he says to him, Zo, that Mishnah that you're quoting is Divrei Rabbi Meir. That was Rabbi Meir's version of the Machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, we have a different transmission of the Machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. Lo nechleku Beit Shammai Beis Hillel Hamazon shehu b'tchila. We certainly should be reciting Birkas Hamazon first, because as we said before, he finished his Suda, he's Chayiv in Birkas Hamazon, and that's immediately pressing. V'al Avdol Shibasol, and he can postpone Avdol until the end of the brachos. Alman nechleku. So what is the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai according to the version of Rabbi Yehuda? Al hamor v'al abesamim. What should be the sequence of the bracha on the ner and on the besamim? Beit Shammai omrim ma'ar v'yachach besamim. First, you start with mar because that's the more critical bracha of Havdalah. Besamim is just for the sake of the neshama yisera. No, now, why does Beis Hillel want the bracha on the Besamim first, which is exactly what Rava did following in the footsteps of Beis Hillel based on the tradition of Rabbi Yehuda. And the explanation here for Beis Hillel and Rava is that since Besamim is Lichvod Shabbos, and it represents the Neshama Yisera, so we should be makdim that bracha to Birchas HaNer. Beit Shammai hold that he has an immediate hanoah from the Ner, and therefore he should start with Ner, the Ma'or, and only afterwards he should make the bracha on Besamim. V'yomer Rabbi Yochanan Nagu Ha'am K'Beis Hillel V'Alibed Rabbi Yehuda. The minig that was accepted l'halacha was like Beis Hillel, the way it was transmitted by Rabbi Yehuda, that the Seder HaBrachos is Mazon. First he starts with Birkas HaMazon, then Besamim, because Besamim, as we said before, is L'chod Shabbos in honor of the Neshama Yisera, and then Ner V'Avdol. So Besamim comes before Ner. Rabbi Yaakov Bar Abba Ikla Lebei Rav. Another story about one of the Amoraim who visited Rava. Chazye and Rabbi Yaakov saw that Rava divrich, means he made a bracha, of Borei Priya Gofen, Akasa Kama, on the first cup of wine that they brought out at the meal, he made a bracha, Li Achar, Siyum HaSeuda, when it came to Birchas HaMazon, Hadar Barech. Rava made a second bracha, Bar Priya Gofen. Akasa the Birchas, on the Kos Yain that upon which they recited Birchas HaMazon V'Yishtik, and he drank it. Amalei, so Rav Yaakov said to Rava, Lama L'chuli Hai, why do you need two brachos? Why do you have to recite Bar Priya Gofen twice? Baruch Lan Mar Chana Zimna. Our master, you have made the bracha once. That should be poter the second kos of yain of Birkas HaMazon. Amalei, so Rava responds to Rav Yaakov, Ki Avina Be'Reish Galusa Ki Avdina. When I visited the house of the Reish Galusa, that's what they did. They recited Bar Priya Gofen on one kos of yain, then they brought another kos of yain, they made another Bar Priya Gofen. Amalei, so Rav Yaakov responds to Rava, Tenach Be'Reish Galusa. I'll tell you why it makes sense that was the minhag, that was the appropriate ruling in the Reish Galusa's house. Da Hachi Avdinon. Why? The Suffolk Maisil and Suffolk Lo Maisil. You're not the Balabais, you're a guest, and you don't know whether or not they're going to bring more wine to the table. So therefore, when you made the bracha on the first kos of wine, you didn't have in mind to patter up second kos of wine. So you needed a second bracha on each kos. But hacha, here you're the balabas. You know exactly how much wine there is. There's more wine on the table. And when you made the first bracha, you already had in mind, knowing that you would drink another kos of Birkas HaMazon after the Suda. So therefore you had kavanah to patter up with that original bracha, the first bracha, the yayin that he's going to drink at the Birkas HaMazon. Why does he need another Bar Priya Gofen? So Rava responds, Ana Avdi Kitalmidei de Rav. And now we tell a story about the Talmidim of Rav. The Rav Brona, Rav Hananel Talmidei de Rav Havu, and Haviyasvi Besudasa. They were sitting at a Suda, and Koi Alayu were now on the top of Kuf Gimel Amid Beis, Rav Yeba Saba. So the elderly Rav Yeba, he was serving them. Amrule, so Rav Bruna of Rav Hananel, the Talmidim of Rav, they turned to Rav Yeva, and they said to him, Havlan v'nivrach, bring us a cup of wine and we'll recite Bori Priya Gofen. Lasof. At the end, they decided that, you know what, we're not ready for Bori Priya Gofen, for Birkas HaMazon. Amrule, they turned around to Rav Yeva and they said to him, Havale v'nichte, you know what, give us another kos and we'll drink it. Amalahu. So Rabbi Yeba said to them, Hachi Amarav, Kevendam Riso Havlon Levarech. Once he said the words, give me the kos so that we can recite Birkas Hamazon, Itasra Lechu Lemichte. It's Asur, Itasra means Velosha Neseres, Alechem, Shtia. You now have an obligation, a requirement to recite Birkas Hamazon once you say the words Havlon V'Nivrech, and therefore I cannot give you another kos of wine to drink my taima. So what's the reason for this? The aschisu dataichu, you had hesech hadas. In other words, you decided that you're no longer eating and drinking. That terminates your meal and generates a chiyuv birkas hamazon. And now you have to be mavareh. And we see from this story that birkas hamazon is itself a hefsek, a siyum, a hesech hadas from the suda. It closes and terminates the suda. And therefore you need another bracha after Birkas Hamazon if you want to drink or eat. Therefore, Rava says, I was noeg to make a second bracha of Bar Pri Hagafen after Birkas Hamazon, even though I had made the first bracha on the first kos of yayin during the meal, because Birkas Hamazon terminates the meal, and any shtia that comes after Birkas Hamazon is a brand new shtia, and is hesech hadas because Birkas Hamazon closes the suda and wedges between the first kos of yain that he drank and the second kos of yain.